The boy didn't ask for money. He didn't cry, steal, or shout. He stood there, small and trembling, holding something wrapped in a faded towel. And when the cashier told him he needed to pay, he simply looked up and whispered, "I promise to pay when I grow up." Inside the harsh white light of the convenience store, time slowed. People stopped. And from the corner by the refrigerator, Adrian Blake turned his head. Adrian didn't often stop at corner stores, especially not in the middle of a biting winter night. But the conference had run late, and his driver had insisted on a break. Adrian only wanted a bottle of water and 5 minutes of silence. Instead, he saw a scene that would split something open inside him he thought had long frozen over. The boy's name was Micah. His jeans were too short, his shoes cracked, his hair stood in wild, tangled tufts, and his hands clutched a baby with a face barely visible through the towel. The baby didn't cry, just breathed shallow, uneven. Adrian stepped forward without thinking. He paid for the formula, the blanket, the small jar of baby food Micah had tried to hide under his sleeve. When they stepped outside, the air hit colder than before. Micah didn't ask for more. He didn't even thank Adrian. He just stood there, arms tight around the baby, and said, "She's my sister. Her name's Hope." Adrian looked at the boy. Really looked. Thin arms, sharp cheekbones, eyes too old for his body. The kind of gaze that knew too much about hunger and waiting, about promises made in vain. And still there was something fierce in how he held his sister. A silent kind of protection. He asked where their mother was. Micah answered quietly that she was under the bridge on 5th, too sick to walk, too scared to go to shelters. He didn't explain further. Just looked down and adjusted the towel around the baby's face. Adrian didn't press. Instead, he handed the boy a coat from his car, a scarf, gloves, and a bag filled with food. He knelt, level with Micah's eyes, and said softly, "I'll be back tomorrow. Same place." Micah nodded once. Not because he believed, but because someone for once didn't look at him like he was a problem. That night, Adrian didn't sleep. He sat by the window of his penthouse, staring out at the skyline that used to make him feel powerful. He had spent decades building a life out of silence, founding a medical tech empire, staying out of tabloids, staying out of reach. His orientation was a chapter he had torn out long ago, when his family turned their backs. Adrian had buried that truth in ambition, in control, in clean lines and quarterly reports. But now, here was this boy. A boy with a baby. A boy who promised to pay when he grew up. A boy who didn't want money. Only trust. And Adrian couldn't stop thinking about the name the boy had said. Hope. He had once written a name in a notebook, years ago, when he was a student and dared to imagine fatherhood. Evan, if it was a boy. Hope, if it was a girl. Just a name. Just a dream. And still, it returned to him like a memory he didn't know he had lost. Sometimes, a quiet encounter in a noisy world is the beginning of something no one expects. Sometimes, the smallest voice echoes the loudest truth. Adrian didn't know it yet, but that boy, that broken promise in winter, was about to rewrite everything he thought he had locked away for good. There are moments when life demands nothing from us, except to choose whether we walk away or turn back and see what truly matters. If this story has moved you, don't forget to follow Heart Story for more tales of quiet bravery, unexpected bonds, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Adrian returned the next morning, earlier than planned. The air was brittle with frost, the kind that settled deep in the lungs and refused to let go. His driver stayed in the car as he walked toward the narrow, crumbling overpass where Micah had said they were staying. He didn't know what he expected, perhaps a grateful reunion, or even silence. But what he found was a war zone of the heart. Kara was curled beneath a pile of wet blankets, her eyes wild and unfocused. She flinched when Adrian approached, shielding Hope with her frail arms. Her voice cracked and full of terror as she shouted at him to stay away. "You're not taking them," she rasped. "Not again. Not like he did. Not like you." Her words weren't coherent. They were fragments, like broken glass reflecting something Adrian didn't yet understand but couldn't look away from. Micah tried to calm her, whispering things into her ear that only made her shiver harder. Adrian stood still, letting the cold cut through him. unsure of what line he had just crossed by coming back. Eventually, with Micah's coaxing and Adrian's stillness, Kara allowed them to help. She didn't walk. She was too weak. Adrian carried her in his arms, her body nearly weightless, as Micah followed close behind with the baby. They didn't speak during the ride to the motel. Not even a thank you, just heavy breathing, the occasional whimper from Hope, and the sound of tires over salted pavement. He paid for 3 nights at a rundown place just off the highway. Not ideal, but warm, dry, inside. Kara collapsed onto the bed and curled up, mumbling to herself in a way that made Adrian's chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness. Later that evening, Adrian stepped out to grab some essentials: diapers, food, clean clothes, and returned to find Micah sitting at the edge of the bed, holding a cup of water for his sister. "She sleeps better when it's quiet," Micah murmured. Adrian sat across from him, not asking questions, just observing. And then, Micah said it slowly, as if unsure he was allowed. "She used to call me Evan," he said. "That was my name when I was born. But she changed it, said it hurt too much." Adrian's breath caught. Evan, the name he had chosen long ago. When he was a medical student, he had once donated anonymously to a fertility program. It was a decision made quickly, part youth, part curiosity, part quiet rebellion. He hadn't thought about it in decades. But now, a thread had been pulled, and his mind began to stitch together the impossible. Was it even likely Micah's age? The name? Kara's breakdown? The bitterness in her voice when she'd looked at him like she'd seen a ghost? Adrian couldn't sleep that night. In the dim motel bathroom, he stared into the mirror and saw not a billionaire or a founder or a man in control. He saw a man with no answers, holding a question that could shake the foundations of everything he'd built to stay hidden. Micah had fallen asleep next to the crib, his arms wrapped around his knees. He had not asked for a father, only shelter, only a moment of stability. But Adrian could no longer look away. The past had clawed its way back through snow and silence, not for reckoning, but for recognition. And somehow, in the fragile stillness of that motel room, Adrian began to understand that some wounds don't bleed, they echo. And sometimes, what we think we buried isn't gone. It's just waiting for the courage to be faced. That night, Adrian called his lawyer. He also booked a private DNA test, one that could quietly confirm or shatter what his gut refused to ignore. Micah never asked who Adrian was or why he kept coming back. But before he fell asleep, he left a note beside Hope's bottle, written in pencil, crooked handwriting. "I don't need a dad. I just need someone who doesn't disappear. Sometimes, the people who seem the most distant are the ones who once had to be brave just to keep breathing." And in that bravery, in that brokenness, there's a quiet education that love, when offered without condition, can reach through time and bring the truth back home. The envelope arrived 2 days later, white, unmarked, folded into the center of Adrian's planner as if it belonged there all along. He didn't open it right away. He carried it from room to room in his penthouse, brushing fingertips over the seal like someone afraid of burning their hands. But when he finally tore it open, everything else faded. Micah was his son. Adrian didn't react like a man in shock. There was no gasp, no breakdown, only a stillness so complete it felt like time had been emptied. He sat down, held the paper in both hands, and stared at the line that confirmed what his heart had whispered since the first night outside that store. Micah, his, Hope by blood, not his, but now by choice tethered to him in a way he could no longer ignore. But what now? Kara still didn't recognize him. She lived in shadows, moving between lucidity and fear, barely speaking, often whispering things that made no sense. Her mind, ravaged by years of instability, trauma, and untreated pain, felt unreachable. And Micah only saw him as a helper, a man who brought soup and diapers and left without asking questions. Someone who didn't flinch when he said he didn't know his birthday, or when he said he didn't want to go to school because no one likes kids who smell like bridges. Adrian watched him closely that week. Quietly, never hovering, just present. He noticed the way Micah always portioned his food, some for now, some just in case. The way he folded Hope's clothes 3 times before placing them into a drawer. The way he refused to sleep unless he could hear her breathing. This was a child who had become both anchor and sail for a family adrift. Adrian wanted to say something, to tell him, to explain that he wasn't just a man who showed up on cold days, but the root of something Micah had never known he was allowed to want. But there was no moment that felt safe, no version of the truth that didn't feel like stealing the little bit of ground Micah had left under his feet. Instead, Adrian did what he could. He called a pediatrician and arranged a full checkup for Hope, quietly covered all expenses, refused to let the clinic bill anyone else. He met with legal advisors to draft a temporary guardianship agreement, one that would allow him to make decisions without triggering state intervention. He hired a trauma-informed social worker to gently approach Kara and begin early steps toward treatment. He did all of this not as a benefactor, not even yet as a father, but as a man slowly understanding the weight of a responsibility he had unknowingly carried for nearly a decade. One afternoon, Adrian returned to the motel with fresh sheets and found a folded piece of paper on the nightstand beside the crib. It was from Micah, written on lined notebook paper in careful block letters. "If anything happens to me, please keep Hope safe. I don't care what you tell her I was. Just let her feel loved." The words struck deeper than any DNA result. Micah wasn't asking for help. He was making preparations, planning for the worst, because that's what life had trained him to do. And Adrian realized something in that moment: being present isn't the same as being enough. Kindness can't undo years of neglect. Money doesn't replace memories that never formed. But love, if given steadily, honestly, without demand, that might just be enough to begin again. He signed the guardianship forms that night. The next morning, he stood before a family court clerk, hand trembling slightly as he submitted them. Temporary custody of Micah and Hope, with full intent to pursue permanency if conditions allowed. The lawyer said the process might be long, that Kara's rights would need careful handling, that nothing would be guaranteed. But Adrian no longer feared complexity. He feared the silence of doing nothing. And so, a new structure began to form, not a perfect one, not even yet a home, but something steady enough for two children to breathe a little easier. Later that week, as Hope slept in a bassinet by the window and Kara underwent intake at a psychiatric facility, Adrian sat beside Micah and asked if he wanted anything special for dinner. The boy didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and said, "I don't need anything fancy. I just like when you come back." There was no contract, no spoken promise, just that simple sentence. And in it, the reminder that children don't need perfection. They need consistency. They don't remember the brand of the blanket, only that someone wrapped it around them. They won't count every gift, only the hours someone stayed. Love doesn't have to arrive with answers. Sometimes, it just has to stay long enough to ask the right questions. The hospital was quiet when Adrian arrived. Long halls coated in antiseptic white, the air humming faintly with machines and whispers. Kara had been moved to the secure psychiatric wing 2 days ago. Since then, Adrian had visited twice, not as a father, not yet, but as someone who couldn't look away. That morning, a nurse met him outside the door and said, simply, "She's having a clear day." Inside, Kara was sitting upright. Her hair was combed, her eyes less glass, more focus. She didn't flinch when Adrian entered. She even nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a truth that had lived between them longer than either wanted to admit. He didn't speak first. He let the silence breathe. Then, almost without looking up, Kara began, "I was 28, still angry at everything, men, my parents, life, but I wanted something that would stay." Her voice trembled on the last word, but she didn't stop. "I chose a clinic. I didn't want a relationship. I just wanted a child I could raise without needing anyone." Adrian stood very still. She didn't know he already knew, that the DNA test had been done, that his name was printed in the corner of a document now stored in a fireproof drawer in his apartment. "I picked a donor code. I didn't even ask for a name. The staff told me he was smart, healthy, quiet, that he wanted to help. That was enough." She paused again. Her hands clenched the blanket in her lap. But then Micah came early. I wasn't ready. I was drowning. And every time I looked at him, I saw a future I didn't think I could survive. So I changed his name, cut off everything. I told myself he'd be better off if I didn't make him a part of my past. Her voice cracked. But I loved him. I swear, I did. Adrian sat in the chair beside her, not interrupting, only listening. She finally turned toward him, her expression softer now, eyes rimmed red from effort more than tears. You were the donor, weren't you? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Kara didn't cry. Instead, she let out a breath so long it seemed to carry years of exhaustion. Then she nodded, slowly. I always knew he deserved better, but I couldn't give it. At that moment, Micah's name echoed down the hall, not from lips, but from memory, as if the space itself had been waiting to release it. And then the door creaked open. Micah stood in the doorway, small and still, his coat too big, backpack slung low, hands clenched around the strap. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the mention of his name had drawn him in like a tide. He had heard enough. He ran before either of them could speak. Adrian chased after him out the door, down the corridor, into the parking lot glazed with slush. The boy was fast, cutting between cars, not stopping until he reached the edge of the sidewalk where salt gave way to gray snow. Adrian called out, but Micah didn't turn around. When he finally caught up, he didn't grab his arm or raise his voice. He simply stood beside him, breathing hard, waiting. Micah finally spoke, his voice low. So it's true, Adrian nodded. And you knew another nod. Why didn't you tell me? Adrian's answer came quietly. Because I didn't want to take away the choice from you. I didn't want you to feel forced to call me anything you didn't mean. Micah looked out across the street where traffic passed in slow bursts. He didn't cry. His face was unreadable, the way only children who've had to grow up too early can make themselves unreadable. Then, softly, he said, I don't know what to feel. Adrian understood because he didn't either. They stood like that for a long while side by side in the cold, breathing steam into the air. No promises, no sudden embrace, just presence. Later, Adrian would drive him home, hand him a warm drink, help Hope into her pajamas, and sit beside Micah's bed without saying anything more. Some truths break things, but others offer the first chance to rebuild. When children are finally told where they came from, they deserve more than an answer. They deserve space to hold confusion and acceptance in the same hand. And the adults around them must be willing to stay not just to explain, but to witness whatever comes next. The papers were signed in a sunlit room that smelled faintly of chamomile and something older, something like closure. Kara sat upright, her hands steadier than they had been in weeks, her eyes focused as she placed her signature on the last form. Temporary guardianship. Official, clean. Adrian didn't speak much. He didn't have to. She had asked him only once, quietly, if he would keep the children together. He answered with a single look, and it was enough. She nodded and signed. Micah and Hope would be under Adrian's care now, legally, safely, and for the foreseeable future. Kara, meanwhile, would remain under treatment. For the first time in years, she no longer resisted help. It was as though the storm in her had calmed, not because she was fixed, but because she knew her children were no longer drifting alone. Adrian brought Micah to visit her once a week. Never forced. Never long. Just enough to remind them that no one was vanishing anymore. At home, the rhythm slowly changed. Bottles and blankets were replaced with bedtime stories. Frozen dinners gave way to shared meals. Silence turned into music. Soft jazz on cold mornings. Hope's giggles in the afternoons. The sound of Micah practicing reading aloud by the fireplace. He was still quiet, still careful with his words. But something in his posture had shifted. He no longer looked like a boy holding his breath. Adrian started introducing Micah as his son, not with fanfare, just gently. When teachers asked, when neighbors waved, when filling out forms at the clinic, each time, the word became a little more real, a little more deserved. Then came the interview request. A journalist had reached out, requesting a profile on Adrian Blake, the reclusive tech mogul turned unexpected guardian. At first, Adrian declined, but after some thought, he agreed, not to make headline, but because he wanted the world, or at least one corner of it, to know that love doesn't always begin with intention. Sometimes, it begins with showing up again, and again, The piece included a quiet detail. Adrian had come out publicly for the first time. Not in protest, not in defiance, but in peace. "I didn't hide because I was ashamed," he told the reporter. "I hid because I thought being invisible would hurt less. But now I want my son to see me." The article ran in a weekend issue, and Adrian didn't think Micah had noticed. But a week later, he found a drawing on his desk, 3 figures under one roof: a man, a boy, and a baby in a crib. The words written in colored pencil. Just below, the shaky outline of a son: "I don't promise to pay, I promise not to leave." And beneath the sketch, one more thing: the boy's full name, in careful letters. A name he had chosen for himself, Evan Micah Blake. Not just a reunion, a recognition. In that moment, Adrian knew this wasn't about biology. It wasn't about court forms, past mistakes, or even forgiveness. It was about one simple truth sometimes. Family isn't found. It's made, rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. Micah had chosen to carry both names, the one given by his mother, and the one his father had once dreamed of. There's power in naming yourself, power in deciding who you are, once you've learned where you came from. That night, they ate dinner by candlelight after a power outage swept the block. Hope slept quietly in her crib. Micah leaned against Adrian's side, and for the first time, Adrian felt no need to fill the silence. It was already full. If you could choose your name, the one that truly reflects who you are, what would it be? And why? Share it in the comments. Your story matters more than you know. And if this journey touched something in you, don't forget to follow Heart Story, where every voice finds its way home.